There are stories in Hollywood that never get told, not because nobody knows them, but because too many powerful people benefit from keeping them buried. The story I'm about to share with you is one of those stories. It involves two of the most iconic names in American entertainment history, and a hatred so carefully concealed that an entire nation watched it happen without ever realizing what was really going on. Johnny Carson spent 30 years behind that desk. 30 years of reading guest lists, shaking hands, forcing smiles, and performing warmth he didn't always feel. But there was one name, one particular name, that made something shift behind his eyes every single time it appeared on that booking sheet. A name that turned the most charming man in television into someone who could barely hold himself together. James Stewart, the man America loved most, the man Carson couldn't stand, and the reason why will change the way you look at both of them forever. James Stewart wasn't just an actor, he was an idea. He was what America told itself it believed in. Born in 1908 in Indiana, Pennsylvania, the son of a hardware store owner, Stewart built his entire career on a single promise to the audience. He would always be the good man, the honest man. The man who stumbles over his words because he's too decent to be dishonest. From Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to It's a Wonderful Life, from Rear Window to the Philadelphia Story, every role reinforced the same image. Here is a man you can trust. Here is a man who represents everything wholesome about this country. And it wasn't just his acting. Stewart enlisted in the military before Pearl Harbor. He flew combat missions over Nazi Germany. He rose to the rank of brigadier general. He married, started a family, lived in a beautiful home in Brentwood. Every photograph, every interview, every public appearance was another piece of evidence that James Stewart was exactly what he appeared to be. A patriot, a family man, a genuinely good human being. America didn't just admire him. America believed in him the way you believe in something sacred. And for decades, that belief held. Johnny Carson welcomed James Stewart to The Tonight Show multiple times between 1963 and 1989. The cameras captured everything the audience wanted to see. Warm handshakes, gentle laughter, Stewart doing his famous poetry readings, his voice cracking just enough to feel vulnerable, just enough to make the studio audience lean forward in their seats and wipe their eyes. It looked like two great Americans sharing a stage. It looked genuine. But according to people who worked behind the scenes on that show, what was happening off camera told a completely different story. A former Tonight Show producer who spent years working alongside Carson described what it was like when Stewart's name appeared on the guest list. With most guests, even ones Carson didn't particularly enjoy, he could find something to work with. He'd stay professional. He'd find an angle. But with Stewart, his jaw would tighten. He'd stare at the booking sheet and say something like, "Do we really have to have him on again?" And the producer would nod and move on, because you didn't argue with Johnny Carson about something like that. You just watched him suffer through it. The audience at home never saw any of this. Carson was too good at his job to let it show. He smiled, he laughed, he played along. But behind those eyes, something was burning. Something had been burning for years. And it all traced back to a relationship that James Stewart had spent his entire life hiding from the world. The story begins in 1932 in New York City, when two young actors from the Midwest decided to share an apartment. James Stewart, fresh out of Princeton, and Henry Fonda, a Nebraska native still grinding through community theater, moved in together to save money while they auditioned for Broadway roles. On the surface, this was an unremarkable arrangement. Young actors pooling resources during hard times. It happened constantly during the Depression. Two guys from similar backgrounds helping each other out. That was the story Hollywood told, and for years, nobody questioned it. But the details of that arrangement don't add up if you actually look at them. Stewart and Fonda shared that apartment for 8 years. Not 1 year. Not 2. 8 full years stretching from 1932 all the way to 1940. And here is where it gets difficult to explain away. According to multiple sources who knew them during that period, they shared a single bedroom. By 1938, both men were starring in major Hollywood productions. Stewart had appeared in You Can't Take It With You, which won Best Picture at the Academy Awards. Fonda had starred in The Grapes of Wrath and Young Mr. Lincoln. Both were earning enormous sums of money. Both could have easily afforded their own apartments. And yet they continued living together in that same small space, in that same shared bedroom, for 2 more years. Whenever anyone asked about those early days, Stewart would deflect. He'd stammer more than usual, give vague answers about friendship and tough times, and change the subject as fast as he could. It became such a consistent pattern that journalists eventually stopped asking. This was the 1930s and 1940s, after all. There were questions you simply didn't push in Hollywood. There were doors that stayed closed because everyone understood what was behind them, and nobody wanted to be the one to open them. When Stewart enlisted in the military in 1941, he and Fonda finally separated. Both men married within a few years of the war ending. Stewart wed Gloria Hattrick MacLean in 1949, when he was 41 years old. For a major movie star in that era, waiting until your 40s to marry was unusual enough to raise eyebrows. But the timing made a certain kind of sense if you understood what was really happening. The studios needed their biggest stars, especially war heroes, to present an image of unquestioned masculinity. Marriage wasn't just encouraged, it was essentially required if you wanted to keep working. A former MGM executive, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, put it bluntly. Those marriages weren't love stories, they were image management. The studios were terrified of the gossip columnists. One wrong rumor could end a career overnight, so they made sure their leading men were photographed with wives and children and everything that came with it. Stewart fit this pattern perfectly. He married Gloria, who already had 2 young sons from a previous marriage, Ronald and Michael. Stewart legally adopted both boys. He and Gloria then had twin daughters of their own. The perfect family appeared on magazine covers. The perfect life was documented in carefully arranged photo spreads. America saw exactly what it wanted to see, a war hero settling down, starting a family, living the dream. What America never saw was what happened inside that house when the cameras were gone. Gloria's 2 adopted sons grew up in the shadow of a man who could play a loving father on screen with devastating conviction, but struggled to connect with them in any real way behind closed doors. A family friend who visited the Stewart home regularly during the 1950s and 1960s described the dynamic in painful detail. Stewart never called them his sons. It was always Gloria's boys or the kids. Never my sons. Never Ron and Mike. There was a wall between them that was difficult to watch if you paid attention. He would be warm and present with his biological daughters, but with the boys there was simply nothing there. They were part of the scenery, part of what the family was supposed to look like. A longtime household employee who worked for the Stewarts during the 1960s offered an even more troubling account. Stewart would go weeks barely speaking to the boys beyond basic pleasantries at dinner. He would disappear into his study for hours, working on model airplanes, organizing military memorabilia, while those kids were desperate for any acknowledgement from him at all. Ronald, the older boy, tried repeatedly to connect with his adoptive father through sports, through school, through anything he thought might get a response. And Stewart would give him one-word answers and return to whatever he had been doing. The contrast with Henry Fonda was stark. Despite Fonda's own complicated personal life and multiple marriages, he maintained genuinely close relationships with his children, particularly Jane and Peter. He showed up. He engaged. He was present in their lives in ways that mattered. Stewart, the man America celebrated as the embodiment of fatherhood, couldn't manage the same with the boys who had legally become his sons. This is where the story takes its darkest turn. On June 8, 1969, Ronald MacLean, Stewart's adopted son, was killed in action in Vietnam. He was 24 years old, serving as a Marine lieutenant when his unit came under heavy fire. His death was devastating by any measure. But what happened afterward revealed something about James Stewart that Johnny Carson found genuinely unforgivable. Stewart became a passionate public supporter of the Vietnam War in the wake of Ronald's death. He appeared at military events, he gave patriotic speeches, he met with Gold Star families, and he wrote a poem. The poem, which blended references to a dog named Bo with themes of loss and sacrifice, became one of Stewart's signature pieces at public appearances. He performed it on The Tonight Show in 1981, more than a decade after Ronald had died. His voice cracked, his eyes filled with tears. The studio audience sat in silence, many of them crying along. It was, by every visible measure, a masterpiece of grief made public, a father honoring his fallen son with raw, unguarded emotion. The nation watched and felt something profound. They believed every second of it. But according to people close to the Stewart family, the relationship between James and Ronald had remained distant and cold right up until Ronald's death. Stewart had reportedly discouraged Ronald from pursuing college, pushing him instead toward military service as a more appropriate path. When Ronald enlisted, Stewart treated it as a photo opportunity. And when Ronald was killed, people who knew the family understood that Stewart saw something else entirely. Not just loss, but an opportunity. A chance to perform grief on a national stage, a chance to prove to America that he had loved this son, even though the truth was far more complicated than any poem could capture. Carson was present backstage the night Stewart performed that poem on The Tonight Show. According to a staff member who was there, Carson went straight to his dressing room afterward and didn't speak to anyone for over an hour. He canceled the usual post-show drinks. He just sat alone. When Ed McMahon finally checked on him, Carson reportedly said something along the lines of that man just performed grief. He performed it the way he performs everything else. And America is buying it. He bought the whole thing. But the poem was only part of what haunted Carson. Because even after Stewart's marriage, even after both men had built separate families and separate lives, his relationship with Henry Fonda never really changed. They bought homes in the same neighborhood in Brentwood, living just blocks apart. They spoke on the telephone multiple times every single day, often about nothing in particular. Their families vacationed together. They attended each other's premieres. They were involved in every significant part of each other's lives in a way that went far beyond what any normal friendship could explain. A colleague who worked with both actors over the years described the dynamic bluntly. These were two married men with their own families, supposedly living completely separate lives. But they had this intensity with each other, this need to be in constant contact. Stewart once had a production manager set up a dedicated phone line in his trailer while filming on location in Montana for 3 months, specifically so he could call Fonda twice a day. Not once in a while. Twice a day, every single day, for 3 months. That is not normal friendship. That is something else entirely. And the people closest to both men knew it. Gloria Stewart understood exactly what her marriage was and what Jimmy's relationship with Fonda truly was. She had made a deal when she married him. Financial security, social stability, protection for her sons, a comfortable life. In exchange, she played the devoted wife and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. It wasn't an unusual arrangement in Hollywood, more common than most people wanted to admit. The wives knew, the studio executives suspected, the journalists heard rumors but never printed them. Everyone understood that speaking the truth could destroy careers, including their own. And Johnny Carson, who knew more than almost anyone, was told explicitly by NBC that he could never bring it up on air. This was James Stewart, an American icon, a war hero. You simply could not touch him, so Carson smiled. He shook Stewart's hand. He laughed at the stories. He listened to the poetry. He played along for 30 years. And every single time he did it, something inside him burned a little more. When Henry Fonda died on August 12, 1982, Stewart's grief was completely, unmistakably genuine. He sobbed at the funeral. He gave interviews about losing his best friend of 50 years. He seemed truly shattered in a way that none of his previous performances had ever achieved. And according to people who worked on The Tonight Show during that period, Carson noticed the difference immediately. That was the only time anyone ever saw Carson show any real sympathy for Stewart, because that grief was real. Whatever that relationship actually was, whether you call it friendship or love or something that doesn't have a simple name, Stewart had lost the most important person in his life, the person who had known him before the fame, before the image, before all the years of carefully maintained lies. Carson recognized genuine emotion when he saw it. He had spent decades watching people perform feelings on his show. He knew the difference, and what Stewart felt when Fonda died was not a performance. Stewart's final appearance on The Tonight Show came in September 1989. He was 81 years old, frail but still performing, still playing the role he had perfected over 6 decades. He read poetry from his new book. He told gentle stories. He was everything America wanted him to be, a beloved grandfather figure, a living piece of Hollywood history. Crew members who were backstage that night described the episode as painful to watch if you knew the history between the two men. Carson moved things along as quickly as possible. He asked the minimum number of questions. The second they went to commercial after Stewart's segment, Carson turned away and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. He just stared at his desk while Stewart was escorted off the set. Afterward, Carson reportedly told his producers something close to "Thank God that's the last time. I don't think I could have smiled through another one of his performances." James Stewart died on July 2, 1997, at the age of 89. The nation mourned. Presidents issued statements. Flags flew at half-staff. Johnny Carson, retired for 5 years by then, said nothing publicly. He attended no memorial events. He gave no interviews about Stewart's legacy. His silence said everything his words never could. Carson himself died in 2005, taking whatever he knew about Stewart to his own grave. Neither man ever spoke publicly about what existed between them. The secret stayed buried. But here is what makes this story more than just gossip about two famous men. Carson was no saint himself. 3 failed marriages, rumored affairs, a drinking problem he mostly kept hidden. He understood human weakness better than most. He wasn't judging Stewart for being human, for having desires that didn't fit the era's narrow definitions of acceptable behavior. What Carson couldn't forgive was the hypocrisy. If Stewart had simply lived his life quietly, kept his private business private, Carson wouldn't have cared. But Stewart didn't do that. He positioned himself as America's moral compass. He lectured the country about patriotism, about family values, about doing the right thing, all while hiding who he truly was. He performed grief over a son he had barely connected with. He played the devoted father while his adopted boys grew up feeling invisible. He built an empire of wholesome appearances on a foundation that was hollow underneath. That was what Carson found unforgivable. Not the hiding, the hypocrisy, not the secret, the performance. James Stewart played decent men his entire career, honest men, good men, men of principle. But he never got to play the one role that might have mattered most, himself. And Johnny Carson, the man who built his career on cutting through Hollywood's phoniness, spent 30 years helping Stewart maintain the biggest lie any of them ever told. That is the real tragedy here. Not one man's deception, an entire culture demanding it.